Okay, let's do a little intro into imperialism. I'm going to try to keep this short, but this is all very interesting to me, so it might not be short. So let's see how it goes. All right, so here's the thing. By the year 1900, Europe takes over. We've been tracing their industrial growth, their competition, etc. So this map here, which is definitely an imperfect map, via the color choices. Like, I'm not really sure why they couldn't find a color to differentiate France from Spain a little better, or Portugal and Germany, but whatever. Or Belgium and US, like, it makes no sense. But what we're looking at here is all the foreign holdings of states by 1900 and independent states. So if you look, for example, Great Britain, in this pinkish whatever, owns a great deal of land. So technically Canada is still part of the empire. They have a holding in South America, obviously New Zealand, Australia, India, much of Africa. Thus, the term or the phrase that the sun never sets on the British Empire. The French also have a ton of land holdings in Africa and French Indochina, aka Vietnam, and we'll check a couple others as well. One thing I want us to recognize, though, is that there are many states that this particular map says is independent. So it's right here in this orange. It says that, much of Latin America is independent, that the Ottoman Empire is independent, that China is independent, Japan, etc. What I want to do is I want to challenge that a little bit, and I want us to recognize that there are multiple forms of imperialism. So there's direct political imperialism, which is what we'll generally be focusing on. And that's the obvious forms of colonialism, right? Where, let's say, the French come into West Africa and install a government and control everything about it, control the economy, control who's in charge, start to impose their language, things like that. But there's also economic imperialism, and we must recognize that economic imperialism can be just as powerful and sometimes more powerful in the long run than direct political imperialism, because it's harder sometimes to identify, and it can also be harder to dismantle. It's really obvious to overthrow a government, to come in, have a revolution, overthrow a government. But to undo certain types of economic dependence and figure out how much control over one's economy controls someone's politics can be super tricky, right? So, for example, if we look at Latin America, one thing that we'll really have to focus on in the 20th century is how much Latin America has become dependent on the United States. And that is very much the foundation for what happened during the Cold War era between the United States and many of these Latin American countries. You would think that, like, whatever these countries do politically is their own thing, but of course it's not. In not only the age of globalization, but also when we start to see how tied some of the economies of Latin America are to the United States. So, for example, when Chile tries to have a socialist revolution, the U.S. gets involved. They help them stage a coup. And that's because the U.S. had so many investments, and really the Chilean government depended on those investments. And so conservative members within Chile worked with the United States government in a 1973 coup. So to say that Latin America is totally independent, is kind of difficult. Likewise, where else shall we go? If we go to China, all right, we'll specifically look at China. And they even give it a phrase in this time period, that these European and the Japanese powers carve up China into spheres of influence, which means that these areas are going to have economic monopolies, and then as a result, they're going to have political influence over certain regions in China. And then also the Ottoman Empire, we'll do a separate study of that. And even though it says it's politically independent, we'll see that they become very dependent on the French and the British via a set of agreements called the capitulations. And so really, by 1900, they can't function without Europe. We even saw this with the Crimean War, as we discussed that and the influence that had on Russia. So they're very dependent. Similarly, in Africa, there claim to be two states, and I know this is hard to tell because they didn't do a good job picking different colors, but there are two states that remain technically independent during this era from the European powers: Liberia and Ethiopia. And I think it's really only fair to call Ethiopia the only independent state, because Liberia is protected by the United States. And that's because Liberia is a territory to which we repatriated our freed slaves. And thus then we protected that region. So no one was ever going to touch that because that's like, under the guise of the United States or under their control. So really Ethiopia is the only state that remains independent. The other state I want to call your attention to is Siam, also known as Thailand. That area does remain independent. And I think it's pretty fair to say it remains pretty independent. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of which goes back to the kings of Siam. So the kings of Siam, when the French in Indochina and the British in Burma were looking up that area, checking it out to see if they could take it over. The kings of Siam were really good at playing the French and the British off of one another. And so through these political machinations, they were able to almost stay independent and convince the British and the French to allow them to remain independent in order to be this buffer state between their two territories. And so as a result, Thailand, or at this point known as Siam, does remain independent. So we got that going on. So really then, if you look at the globe, there's very few places that remain quite politically and economically independent. So we'll watch how that plays out over time. So let's get into some of the motivations/reasons that the Europeans were able to, in about a century, take over the whole world. All right, so motivations. Nationalism is a key motivation. And we took a look at that via one of our videos recently. So the idea is that we start to have a greater sense of what it means to be a nation or a nation state, which is a really new concept in this era. So now we start to define our borders. So we have our kind of geographic integrity. We start to have a greater sense of cultural nationalism, so the languages and religions and art and whatnot that defines a state, whether it's the German state, the British state, whatnot. But also we have this sense of pride and competition, right? So linked with what's going on economically throughout the world and militaristically, it's really important that our nation outcompetes the others as this point of national pride. And that very much is why this happens so fervently, as also so quickly, because you can't just take your time going out and getting resources and building up your military. You better do it quick because these other nations are making it happen, right? And that also gets to our second point, which is this economic competition for natural resources. So all the nations that are imperializing this era have industrialized, but Europe is limited in its natural resources. And so they need to look abroad to get lots of other resources to process, to make goods to sell, or to help with their military kind of industrial complex, right, which is slowly growing over time. So we need to get those goods and we need to get them before our neighbors get them. And so they're going to go out into the world and gobble everything up. We also start to have some philosophies that help to either legitimize or motivate these nations to take over the world. You should have been introduced to the concept of social Darwinism in your American studies. So social Darwinism is piggybacking off of Charles Darwin's theories of evolution and the idea of survival of the fittest, which we know in a biological sense, explains the idea that those organisms that are best adapted to an environment are the most likely to survive, and applied to geopolitics. Many Europeans were arguing that looking at the state of their nations at that point, they were the most fit, right, the most industrialized, they had the largest armies. And so not only does that legitimize their going out into the world and imperializing, but also justified it in terms of saying that they should, right, that they found the most fit path and they should teach others to do so. And also, the spread of Christianity is both motivation and some people see it as a form of justification. So the idea of going out into the world and spreading this faith, we have to remember that Christianity is an exclusive faith that is very dependent on and supportive of missionary activity. And then we also have our enablers. I'm going to go back to a couple of those other points later and in other contexts. But so we have our motivations, but we also have the things that made this happen. Because it's maybe you want to go over and take over the world, right? But what are the technological advances that allow the Europeans to do so? So the improvement in weapons technologies is central to this. There are lots of types of weapons and improvements in ships and whatnot that allow this to happen. But often historians point to the Maxim gun as the most important of these inventions. It's our first machine gun. And so now this means that you don't need to dedicate so many individuals into invading a place, that you can reduce your troops. But if you have this Maxim gun, that's like having a gigantic army, because you can just sit back and kind of roll through your artillery and just mow all of these people down without having to put too many people on the ground. That's going to give them an extreme advantage. Also, our medical technologies. So Europe, even with their rudimentary but still better guns that they might have had in, let's say, the 18th century, they might have taken over parts of, let's say, Central Africa or in and around like the French in Indochina. But the problem is when they showed up, they died, right? Because just like the Native Americans fell to European diseases, Europeans would fall to equatorial diseases like malaria, yellow fever, things of that nature. But as they begin to develop better medical technologies, now Europeans can survive in these regions like they hadn't before. Probably the most important of these is quinine, which they discovered in Latin America. And processing that, they found that to be a cure or preventative against malaria, which was the number one disease that gave them the most difficulty in all these areas around the equator. Right, so now the Europeans can take these drugs, they can remain and develop these colonies in places that they couldn't do so before. So now they're good to go. And of course, also transportation technologies. So similarly, their boats and whatnot beforehand might have been too weak to get through some of these difficult rivers. So, for example, the Congo River is a really tumultuous river, and there's no way that the ships would have been able to traverse that river without the power of the steamships before that. So steamships will help with that. And also, they're big, so you can transport all these goods and all these troops so that you can do your stuff. So in every which way, steamships are helping. And also railroads. We can lay railroads, especially when we get to places like India and the interiors of India or the interiors of Africa. This means that we not only can look over our territories better and make sure there's no rebellions, but we can move the goods around and then make more money, and then in turn develop it even more and build up your own economies and build up your own militaries, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we're all working towards World War I right now, if you didn't catch that. So all these things are enabling the process. Europeans might have wanted to take over before, but now they can because they got the better stuff. This is a machine gun, or the Maxim gun. So 2 people to make it work and kill lots and lots of people. The most famous quote that's associated with the Maxim gun is by Hilaire Belloc, or however you say his name, the inventor of it. So it's whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. So recognizing that this is quite an advantage over other groups, and surely one that killed a lot of non-Europeans. I also want to briefly talk about the missionaries a bit more. We're going to have to keep our eye on the influence of Christianity. So the missionaries, we have to be aware that in some ways, some of the work of the missionaries was indeed very sincere, right? This belief that they were doing good, right, by converting people to Christianity and saving their souls. Also, some of them set up really important charities that did help to improve the lives of some of the quote-unquote conquered peoples. And the other thing that many missionaries did is that because they were motivated by something more than wealth and more than military prestige, but they were motivated by something so huge as faith, they were often willing to take some of the first steps into these unknown and scary regions. So one of our best examples of that is Dr. Livingstone, who was a missionary who worked on behalf of the British. He was, via his name, he was also a medical doctor. And he is best known for going into what we now know as the Congo, or Central Africa. And this was seen as a really big deal because no Europeans had done any lengthy exploration of Central Africa. It was a place that they were really frightened of. Africa had the nickname the Dark Continent, not because of the pigment of the people's skin, but because it was such a mystery. Like, what was in the middle of it? They didn't have documentation. Nobody was going to risk it. And so when he went into Central Africa, he began to map it. And via mapping it, and this is one of his maps, it's imperfect, but it's way better than they had before. But by having these maps, they can start to just divvy it up and identify resources and figure out if it's worth it, right, to send more troops in. So he did this with the intention of converting people and just general curiosity and exploring. We have to remember that this is also the spirit of exploration. This is some Teddy Roosevelt stuff, right? Going into Africa, going into India, just for the fun of it, right? To hunt certain animals and the glory of all that type of stuff. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Yes, he wanted to convert people, but he wanted the glory of exploration. And he was brave enough to do it before other Europeans. And so even though we might look at this as either a bit of an innocent endeavor or a noble endeavor, even if he truly thought he was saving people's souls, we have to recognize that Christianity could be tricky. And I think this is best summed up in this quote, which has been attributed to a lot of people. It's been attributed to Jomo Kenyatta, who we'll learn about in the independence movements of Africa. It's been attributed to other people, but most often I see it attributed to Desmond Tutu, who is a bishop in South Africa. We'll talk about him more later. But the quote is, "When the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, 'Let us pray.' We closed our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land." If this quote is attributed to Bishop Desmond Tutu, right, someone who is Christian, it's showing you that even someone of the faith recognizes that there was a little bit of deception here, that perhaps the promise of Christianity was used as a way to distract the Africans, give them this hope of salvation, while the Europeans took advantage and exploited them and exploited the land, right? So we're going to have to watch for that as well a little bit. All right, so we should tackle the concept of the white man's burden, which should not be new. You should have learned this, again, in the American history context. But just in case you haven't, it's important to revisit this. So the idea of the white man's burden is a term that was thrown around and becomes popularized by Rudyard Kipling. And if you're looking at your notes, I have the length of the poem printed out for you. So the British poet Rudyard Kipling wrote this in response to the American action in the Philippines. And we do need to remember that the Americans are a part of this imperial process as well. Even though the United States doesn't set up classic colonies, they do begin to have protectorates. I mean, what is Puerto Rico, So we get many of these islands in the Caribbean during the Spanish-American War. We get a short-term influence over the Philippines because of the Spanish-American War, because of the idea of the Monroe Doctrine and how that was threatened by Spanish actions, or possibly threatened by Spanish actions. If you remember in American studies, the Spanish-American War started when the USS Maine, quote unquote, blew up. We blame that on the Spanish. There's lots of controversy over whether or not the Spanish did that, or whether or not that was an action done by Americans to legitimize a war against the Spanish, to take certain territories and fully kick out any vestiges of European power in the Americas. So who knows, whatever, right? But the U.S., we are also doing imperial actions, right? We're getting involved in a war between Panama and Colombia in order to justify the construction of the Panama Canal. We, of course, like I said, in the Spanish-American War, begin to make protectorates out of former Spanish colonies like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, Guam. This is why we have Guantanamo Bay in Cuba still today, even after all of our conflicts with Cuba. Right, so looking at this, and then of course looking at other imperial actions, Rudyard Kipling writes the poem "White Man's Burden," I prefer to do this in class discussion, but we're having difficulty getting together lately, so I'll kind of give you some people's takes on this poem. Rudyard Kipling wrote a lot of stuff, including the Jungle Book. Rudyard Kipling lived most of his life in India, and even though he was British-born, many Brits lived in their colonies, some of whom never actually went to England because they were born and raised in like South Africa or Kenya or India. So Rudyard Kipling, he has a bit of a mixed bag perspective on the idea of imperialism. And so let's read along a little bit and analyze these cartoons, and then we'll move on. So we'll just do the first two stanzas together so you can follow along. So he says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, and 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. I lied, let's do another one. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, and end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly, bring all your hopes to naught. So some people are embracing this term, the white man's burden, in this era, as if it is a true and good thing, right? So if we look at this cartoon that is analyzing the American invasions and dealing with the Philippines. Here we have Teddy Roosevelt, right? And it's so obviously Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, that man can be totally with his back to you and you just know who he is. But here it says U.S. And here he is taking a quote-unquote native of the Philippines. And he's carrying him over his shoulder up this hill, right, to a schoolhouse with an American flag planted on top of it, right? So he is putting in this effort, right, to give him an education like he's never had before. You can see the boots of a soldier buried there. So acknowledging that people died in this effort to give this quote-unquote savage education, right? That is the white man's burden to civilize the natives, civilize these savages. But if you read the poem, there are certain lines that are just filled with oxymorons, right, and hypocrisies and paradoxes, right, that make us recognize that this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, just a bit satire. Such as the savage wars of peace, and to say that in the second stanza that the Europeans were seeking another's profit and working another's gain, that everything they were doing was out of the goodness of their hearts, and all those profits were going to go back to those nations. We know is crap, right? We know the Europeans are profiting insanely from these things, and the guilt that the Europeans are laying on, Kipling picks up in this first stanza. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, right? We're not sending random people. We're sending our best. We're sending our sons, all in the humble service of our natives. And so he's definitely satirizing some of the efforts of the Europeans here, especially those quote-unquote paternalistic attitudes that some Europeans have. Like, here we are, these father and mother figures, and let us teach you childish savages how to live better, right? Or the fact that in Kipling's poem, he recognizes that some Europeans barely looked at these different people as fully human. Instead, they looked at them as half devil and half child. And thus the part of them that is human is child. And so, we're seeing a lot of this attitude swirling about. Some people are satirizing it. Some people are quite sincere, right, in this belief. This is another cartoon from this era. Right here we have Uncle Sam. And we have the British John Bull carrying their colonial subjects up this mountain, right? So they are helping them over these boulders of barbarism, ignorance, vice, brutality, superstition, cannibalism, slavery, cruelty, etc., etc. And so in each basket are the territories that they own. So what we got here? We got the Cubans and different, the Filipinos and Africans. And here for the Brits, we have the Chinese and the Zulu and India and Ottoman, etc. Right, and so they're bringing them up to civilization, right? So these attitudes are helping to, justify it, but we must be a bit critical of them. Another philosophy, right, that helps to justify much of this is the growth in the belief of scientific racism, right, which is the deliberate misuse of science to prove the superiority of some races over others, to justify their imperialism. And it's so sad that these would be some highly published scientists, and that some people are still believing this crap still today. Arthur Gobineau, in his essay, The Inequality of the Human Races, really brings up a lot of it here. So I just picked some excerpts of it so we can see some of the language. And pretty much what they're doing is miscategorizing biological studies. There's also a heavy use on phrenology. Actually, let me look at that really quickly, and then we'll go back to the quotes. So what they would do is study skulls, and the belief, and now none of this is accepted by science, but the belief is that skull shape and the way that your bones fused would tell you just how intelligent you are. And they would produce these graphs to show that the Europeans were superior to other groups. And so in this chart, they are showing the Greek with the ideal skull shape for maximum, brain development, next to the Creole Negro, next to a chimpanzee, trying to draw the comparison that the Negro's skull shape is very similar to the chimpanzee. But here's the thing. It's crap. Like, none of it's supported by modern science. And even at the time, it was really controversial, and most people didn't accept this as true science, especially because often some of these racist scientists deliberately either found someone with a really irregular skull shape, right? Maybe they had some sort of trauma during their birth or just some other anomaly and say, oh, this is the classic skull shape of the Creole Negro, and they have kind of a jutting jaw just like a chimp does. But really, this would just be a one-off. This would be a very specific case. Or they would deliberately put like a chimp or some other primate's skull in a case and say it belonged to an African and straight lie about it. One thing I think is interesting is that this isn't something that they would only do to, let's say, Africans or Asians, but they would even do it within Europe. So, for example, here is using profiles similarly. And, like, honestly, profiles, like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, I can't believe anybody accepted this crap. But they would say that the profile of the Anglo-European was a sign of intelligence, and the jutting, jaw of the Negro is lesser intelligence. And here they compared it to the Irish. So this Irish Iberian, also similarly like a jutting type jaw or muzzle, showed that they were of lesser intelligence, which, I mean, I'm pretty Irish. I don't look like this. And so all of it's just false in a way to justify the quote superiority or the domination of some groups over others. Is total garbage. But anyway, back to Gobineau. Gobineau's The Inequality of the Human Races has such choice quotes as these that become pretty well accepted in this time period. Every people, great or small, has begun by making inequality its chief political motto, as if that's a good thing. This is the origin of all systems of caste, of nobility, and aristocracy. I mean, so he's right. Like, as soon as we started to do agriculture and have job specialization and differentiated wealth, yes, there's been inequality. Then he goes on to say, intolerance is one of the chief notes of European civilization. The purer a race keeps its blood, the less will its social foundations be liable to attack. Okay, cool. The Negro variety is the lowest, just straight up. The yellow races are clearly superior to the black, agreeable, and take direction well, right? They're referring to Asians. We come now to the white peoples. These are gifted with reflective energy, or rather with an energetic intelligence. They have a feeling for utility, a perseverance, a greater physical power, an extraordinary instinct for order, a remarkable and even extreme love of liberty. The white races are further distinguished by an extraordinary attachment to life. When they're cruel, they're conscious of their cruelty. It's doubtful whether such consciousness exists in the Negro. And so all of it's like super obviously upsetting. And what they're able to do with this information, as we'll see, the political takeovers, the abuse of certain groups, and the long-term impact, right, of this time period, we'll see is pretty devastating, pretty intensive. So we'll have to watch that. And so I'll close this with a children's book for you. This is an actual children's book from this time period called An ABC for Baby Patriots. So let's enjoy this and how kind of insane it is. I thought I could enlarge this for zoomable. I guess that's a little better. Whatever. All right, so let's read through this. It's kind of insane. Oh, it's back again. An ABC book for baby patriots. A. A is the army that dies for the queen. It's the very best army that ever was seen. There's B and C, so we can get into some of the imagery here, right? So a lot of the servitude of the different groups. B stands for battles by which England's name has forever been covered with glory and fame. C is for colonies. Rightly we boast that of all the great nations, Great Britain has most. Good for you in engendering nationalism amongst your kids. D is for daring. We show on the field, which makes every enemy vanish or yield. E. So here I have a kid in a little Kaiser helmet and a French poodle checking out the globe. E is our empire, where sun never sets. The larger we make it, the bigger it gets. F. F is the flag, which wherever you see, you know that beneath it, you're happy and free, unless you are African or Indian or Asian of any sort. G is for game. We preserve with such care to shoot as it gracefully flies through the air. H, I think is a hound. Okay, H is for hunting. For this, you have a box, a thoroughbred hunter, some hounds in the box, whatever. I, classic, so you can guess where this might be going. In this illustration, check out the servitude. I is for India, our land in the east, where everyone goes to shoot tigers, nice, and feast. J is for judges, who sit in a row and send folks to prison when naughty, you know. That's how law works. All right, so this is an image I obviously wanted you to see. It's pretty messed up here. If we look at these African quote-unquote kings and the racist way they're shown, K is for kings. Once warlike and haughty, Great Britain subdued them because they'd been naughty. That's how we're explaining subjugation to the kids. L is the lion who fights for the crown. His smile when he's worried is changed to a frown. I don't know what's going on in this image. It's pretty weird. M is for magnets, so great and so good. They sit on gold chairs and eat turtle for food. FYI, turtles and turtle soup in particular became so popular that the British led to the extinction of like dozens of turtle species, all so they could make them into soup. And as the Navy, we keep a spithead. It's a sight that makes foreigners wish they were dead. O is the ocean, where none but a fool would ever dare question our title to rule. Whatever, that one's boring. P is our parliament, commons and peers. They will talk if permitted for months, nay, for years. Which is true. You should watch British Parliament. It's actually pretty entertaining. Q is our queen. It fills us with pride to see the queen's coach when the queen is inside. Can't see her, though. R is the roast beef that has made England great. Roast beef? That's what you got for R? Come on. I'm not even going to finish that one. Scott is Scott. What? Scotland's what? Get better than that. Come on, guys. T is the tub that an Englishman takes as a matter of course just as soon as he wakes. U is our unicorn. Such a nice beast. His home is here now, though he comes from the east. That's a very disturbing picture. I hope that lady is okay. These volunteers who can shoot very straight, they are drilled now and then between 7 and 8. Oh, nubs. I think all the good ones have passed. W, oh, no, this is a good one. W is the word of an Englishman true. When given, it means what he says he will do. Here he is forcing this African chief, probably Zulu, to sign a treaty. Don't do it, dude. He's gonna lie to you. X as a rule, lame. The London police who are paid by the country for keeping the peace. Y is for youngsters, gilded and gay. The newspapers call them that word. Cool pants. Z is a zeal, which is everywhere seen when a family practices God Save the Queen. So there we have the chubby British family. Okay, anyway, so that's our intro to imperialism, and we will go throughout the world and look at how it's been affected by this process. Goodbye.